Hello and welcome to Telesur. I'm Ian Bruce and this is Interviews from Quito, the program where we explore some of the big challenges facing this country and the region. In today's program, free trade between Ecuador and the United States. President Trump pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership right at the beginning of his presidency. Now he's raised tariffs on steel and aluminium and looks set on a full-blown trade war with China. Yet Ecuador's government seems to be banking on some kind of free trade deal with the North. So are they deluding themselves? And who would benefit anyway? To talk about this, we're very pleased to have with us Patricio Alarcon, President of the Quito Chamber of Commerce. But first, let's look at this short video.
Campesino organizations in Ecuador are worried that the trade agreement with the United States would flood the Ecuadorian market with cheap, often subsidized, U.S. products.
It would totally destroy our products, rice, potatoes, etc. It would damage our agricultural sovereignty and security. Apart from that, we would be importing GMOs.
The government is not calling it a free trade deal, but that doesn't convince indigenous organizers like José Agualsaca.
We will fight against this agreement. They may call it as they wish, but we know it is a free trade agreement. Ecuador, let's remember what's happening with corn and tortillas in Mexico, what's happening in Colombia and Peru.
The business sector is confident this possible agreement would benefit the country. But on both sides of the argument, many people want to see more detail of what such an agreement would contain before they take a final position.
Patricio, thank you for coming in. Trade negotiations are a complicated business, so maybe we could start by giving our viewers a bit of context. I mean, what is Ecuador's foreign trade? How's it evolved over the last couple of decades? What does it export? What does it import? To who? From who?
Yes, basically foreign trade consists in an interchange of different products your country has to offer, what comparative advantages your country has in order to meet the needs of other consumers in other parts of the world. It's basically exporting more volumes and developing certain sectors for the country. Ecuador mainly has exported petroleum, bananas, the shrimp industry, and exportations have basically doubled during the last decade. What's important is to focus on sustainable exportations, which sometimes aren't related to oil or the mining industries due to the prices. There are prices can change in the market, and your country will be affected with the price changes in commodities. But basically, Ecuador exports oil, Ecuador exports gold, Ecuador exports bananas, shrimp, cacao for the chocolate industry.
And has that the composition of those exports and the balance between the different sectors, has that changed significantly over the last 20, 30 years?
It has changed over the last decade since the prices, oil prices got to levels of $120 a barrel, and then they went down, stabilizing at about $55 a barrel. So now the other products have gained a certain volume, replacing oil exportation. So yes, the balance has changed, and Ecuador historically has exported more of petroleum, more dollars have entered the country when oil prices have risen. Example, before the 70s, the last decade, and that has helped the economy, but for a certain period of time, because resources haven't been managed correctly. So now the idea of trade is creating value for your country. What can you export, and what can help the economy grow and people?
But the other side, of course, is imports.
Yes. But yes, and what can you import? Because it's simple. A country can't produce everything. Certain needs have to be met with importations, and you have to export in order to bring dollars into the economy. But you have to find a balance, and that balance is through foreign trade. And why foreign trade? Because foreign trade doesn't only consist on exporting goods. It also consists in attracting investment opportunities. Why? Because laws are clear, and the rules are clear once you set up a trade agreement.
So what trade agreements has Ecuador already got or been involved in the past? And what have been the characteristics of that? What have been the effects?
Yes. First of all, the Andean region, it's one of its main partners. Peru, Colombia, Venezuela before, and now the European Union. There was a trade agreement with the European Union.
Just last year.
Just last year.
I was thinking really before that, because I wanted to talk about the EU trade deal.
Yes, and before that, the Andean Pact, which was very interesting, and there were certain products that Ecuador exports more than before, and also, of course, Ecuador imports from the Andean Pact, and
but relatively small quantities, no?
I mean, for the Ecuadorian economy, they are not small quantities, but then again, if you open more markets, you could export a lot more. You just have to make a good deal. The negotiation has to be you have to be very careful in order to maintain certain jobs for a certain period of time.
So you mentioned the trade deal, free trade deal with the European Union, signed I think at the beginning of last year. What are the specific characters? Is that very different from, say, the Andean agreement before?
No.
Does it have different characteristics?
It's not. They aren't different characteristics. The negotiation is now different because they give us a period of time in order to bring down tariffs. Let's say the auto industry. They gave us 7 years in order to bring those tariffs back to zero, to protect the national industry. So the national industry has to be prepared in 7 years to be able to compete with the European automotive industry. To give you an example, the deal with the European Union has very positive for Ecuador. Why?
In what way? Yeah.
Because there's around 300,000 jobs that depend on those exportations. And they're not from large corporations, but from medium or small-sized businesses.
What kind of areas?
Agro-industrial businesses, specifically, which can also lead to the industrial process. Not only huge farms or great extensions, but there are certain businesses that do export with better advantages to that.
Just to help people visualize, can you give me an example of a specific?
Let's say chocolate.
Okay. What was the situation with chocolate before? What could it be now?
Let's say chocolate didn't pay any tariffs in order to enter the European Union. Before they used to pay tariffs, let's say at 15%, just to give you an example. Now they don't pay that a tariff, and it makes our product more competitive for the European consumer.
Okay, but I mean, chocolate is something that people can relate to, so let's talk about chocolate.
Okay.
Yeah? I mean, Europeans eat Cadbury's, Lindt, whatever, there's Nestle's, I mean, to what can Pachari or, relatively small Ecuadorian producers of chocolate compete in the European market with those massive big corporations?
They can compete because of certain advantages. I'm going to give you the product as an example. Not necessarily that product will meet the characteristics I'm going to give you. But let's say Ecuador can produce organic chocolate, and there's a niche, there's a market in the European Union that will consume at a better price organic products. No GMOs, non-transgenic products. Ecuador can produce that, and we will have advantages in the European community as well. But if you can sell products at a better price, you will be able to place your product in markets and compete with Asia and compete with our neighbors, and that's what's interesting of a trade agreement. You can export more volumes of different products, and that will create more jobs in our country. That will help our country.
Okay, but well, I want to come back because obviously there are also sectors of society who are very worried about the impact of free trade deals, domestic producers. We'll come on to that in a moment. But okay, let's move on to the proposed trade deal with the United States. I understand that would have some significant differences from a deal with the European Union, yeah?
Well, first what we have to do is analyze what were the main points of the European Union trade agreement, and compare that with what has been going on in Colombia and Peru with the U.S. agreement. And that can prepare us for our negotiation, because President Trump has spoken about signing trade agreements, but they have to be fair for the U.S. in the same conditions. And I think I think we can get to an agreement with the European Union. It took us years to sign the agreement. Colombia and Peru signed the agreement, I think, in 2014. Ecuador signed it in 2017, the first month of 2017, January, I believe. So you have to negotiate in a way that your country has an advantage. What happened with the European Union? And I'll give you an advantage.
Why did it take longer in Ecuador? Is that because Ecuador was trying harder to protect its industry?
Yeah, it was trying harder to protect its industry. It went against the government policy of the Rafael Correa's government. Was thinking a lot about protecting our industry and not exporting more of our products, not opening our markets. They didn't agree necessarily with trade agreements, and that it's more of an ideological point of view. And what has happened? The effects are clear. Since we opened the trade agreement with the European Union, our exportations have grown in an 11%. Just in the agro-industrial industry, our exportations from 2016 to 2017 grew in $1 billion. So it's been positive. We maintained 300,000 jobs. We created more jobs. I can't quantify the number right now, but it was very positive for the Ecuadorian industry. And there are products that are increasing in their volume. And what's going on with the U.S.? The U.S. is our major trade partner. We export around 30% of our exports, including oil sales, and without oil, if we take away the oil exportations, we export around 20% of our total exports to the United States. The United States is close. Tariffs, transportation costs are lower in the United States. It's a huge market.
But correct me if I'm wrong, the US normally negotiates harder trade deals than the European Union. Is that right? I mean, it's not... the European Union trade deal, I think, allowed certain measures of protection for local industry and so forth, which probably would not be possible in a deal with the United States. Is that right?
There are different... what's going on right now with the European Union? They aren't looking into arbitration and mediation centers outside outside Latin America. The bids, these agreements, contractual agreements, the European Union doesn't focus so much on that, but the U.S. wants bilateral trade agreements, and they want international arbitration. That's an example I can give you. It was easier to negotiate a trade agreement with the last government. Now it's going to be harder.
Why?
Because President Trump has another way.
Another way of thinking. I wanted to get onto that too. Yeah. I mean, let's go back to the sectors that aren't happy with trade agreements. You know, I mean, I think some, local agriculture, local, small, medium businesses, industries producing for the local Ecuadorian market. Are they not worried about being put out of business by cheap imports?
Certain producers can be worried and should be worried. Corn producers, just to give you an example. And why? Because the U.S. subsidizes a lot of its produce. And what's the problem? You can come around that problem if you negotiate and if you have an excellent negotiating team. Why? Because what the president of the U.S. says is that he wants a fair trade agreement. He wants equal conditions if he was to sign a trade agreement. And if there's if the government subsidizes some products, then we can't let those products enter our country without a tariff, and that's fair. And I think they will agree with that. And yes, what they should be worried about is having an excellent trade team in order to come up with a good negotiation for both parts. And then again, you have to, it's a matter of time. You have to develop a competitive industry throughout time, because the world is changing. The world is opening to free trade agreements. Right now, there's a small problem with China and the U.S., but I'm sure that will be solved soon. Well, okay, it's going to become a problem.
Let me play devil's advocate then, because for 2 or 3 decades, the dominant, orthodoxy, the prevailing wisdom in Europe, North America, and many other parts of the world was free trade is good, we want more of it, and so forth. Yeah,
that has developed countries, yeah.
Well, and even in many countries in Latin America for a long time,
Yeah, but that has helped countries in Latin America, like Colombia, like Peru, like Chile.
But that seems to have changed. Something fundamental seems to have changed in recent years. I mean, at the level of the population, free trade doesn't seem to be very popular. That's one of the reasons for the difficulties in the European Union. It's one of the reasons why Donald Trump was elected.
Yes.
Even Hillary Clinton in the election campaign had to come out and talk against the TPP, because it wasn't popular.
It's not popular, but it does help countries. Why? Because they're sending a message that's not a correct message. They want to protect their jobs. They want to protect their industries. Countries should look into their comparative advantages. Countries should work on what they can export. The U.S. can export services, franchises. They're making a lot of money, and that's what they should focus on. You're not going to open up.
But if the population doesn't go along with it, politicians won't be able to get away with it.
Yes, and that's a mistake, because trade creates value. Trade creates better businesses, more competitive businesses. Countries focus on what they should focus once they open trade agreements. And there's examples. Look at Chile, for an example. It's the country that has more trade agreements in Latin America, and per capita, it's the country that exports the most, probably. They are consequent with their vision. They're exporting. They're working on trade agreements.
But why isn't it possible to win over the population to this then? Why is there so much resistance?
Because sometimes the population doesn't elect the leaders they should elect. Sometimes populism prevails in many countries. Latin America has been crushed by populism during the last few decades. And that has been a problem, because we haven't been able to educate our population so they can make the right decisions. And look at the numbers of free trade agreements. Look at what happened to Colombia. Look at what happened to Chile. Look at what happened to Peru. Colombia is receiving around $12 billion a year in direct investment, foreign investment. Peru, around $6 billion. Very important. Many industries are developing. Jobs are being created.
But are they? I mean, there's obviously sectors who feel they're losing jobs. I mean, blue-collar workers in the United States elected Trump because their plants had shut down, they all moved abroad.
But they're not sustainable in time. And that's the problem they have. And the U.S. has to focus on a certain strategy. Look at industries that are creating jobs, that are generating a certain value in the economy. Let's say Apple, Google, Amazon,
but you can't have the whole population working for Google and Apple, right?
But then you have McDonald's, then you have Apple, then you have Google, then you have there's billions of dollars in different types of businesses. But you have to focus. You need a strategic development plan. Each country has to focus on what they can do and what they can create value, how they can create jobs. And that's a mistake that many countries don't have a strategy in the long term. And then they come into these type of problems. And that's a reaction. Look at what's going to happen. Do you think somebody's going to go and open an aluminum plant in Detroit right now? Just to give you an example. That's not going to happen. And it's a mistake. Donald Trump shouldn't increase those tariffs. China shouldn't increase tariffs into the U.S. because they're destroying value. They're going to destroy jobs. And it's a power position right now. And it's a huge mistake for the world.
But if that is the dynamic at the moment, can a small country like Ecuador really expect to kind of, convince the United States that it wants a free trade deal?
I actually think we can, because we have complementary products that the U.S. can consume, and vice versa. I mean, they can. First of all, companies in the U.S. need to grow. They need to expand their markets. We need foreign investment, first of all. Second of all, we produce a lot of bananas, shrimp, flowers, products that aren't being produced in the U.S., to give you an example. And that's what they can buy, and that's what we can focus on. And I think there's a lot of points in which we are going to agree.
What impact would it have on, say, small-scale peasant agriculture, campesino agriculture in Ecuador?
I think that's an opportunity so you can formalize certain sectors, especially small agricultural businesses. Why? Because you can integrate them into the industry which can process certain products that can be sold in the U.S. Smaller shrimp farms that could sell to the people who package the shrimp, who sell to the U.S. That's an example. Coffee, you could plant coffee, sell your coffee in other markets. But it gives you the opportunity to integrate to a huge market instead of depending on a 14 or 15 million population. I mean, Ecuador doesn't have enough consumption for certain industries. And what we need to do, look, if you look into sustainable growth, how do you bring a country out of poverty? If its economy grows at a 7% rate. In order for us to grow and enter those rates, we need to sell more, export more, open more businesses. We won't be able to do that depending on government investment, because now we don't even have oil prices that'll justify the government to invest more.
What would be the main obstacles to negotiating a deal with the United States? I mean, we can't get into all the detail because it's very complicated, but what would be the obstacles?
There's a new charge in customs. They're charging for a service they're not giving. That's an irritant.
For imports?
For imports, yeah. The IST, there's a tax you have to pay once you take your money out of the country. So I have to pay for an invoice. They charge me a 5% more in order for the currency to leave the country.
So that's those are things which would have to be...
That has to be changed, of course. That's not fair. I mean, they're going to the first thing they're going to say, hey, look, we don't charge for any service in our customs. We don't charge in order to make payments. We don't charge a 5% more on your currency. That's an abroad. Yeah, but the Chevron, Chevron can be an irritant as well.
You mean the pollution case in the Amazon?
Yeah, if Ecuador doesn't respect what, I guess on a trial basis, arbitration centers, what develops in that sense, that could be an irritant. Julian Assange could be an irritant.
So there's a pretty big, they're not just trade issues, there's serious political issues for the Ecuadorian government.
Ideological issues. What we spoke about, the bids, the investment contracts, that could be an issue.
But that could cost the government politically very dearly if, for example, it was felt by sections of the Ecuadorian population they'd let Chevron get away with contaminating the Amazon in order to get a trade deal, or they'd handed over Julian Assange to the authorities in order to get a trade deal. I mean, that would...
Look, we're talking about business. I don't think anyone in Ecuador would care if they hand Julian Assange over to the authorities. Julian Assange doesn't give us any value at all whatsoever. Ecuador is in the middle of somebody else's problem. You're not going to go pick a fight with two giants if you're a small guy in the street. It's not logical. The Assange case. Chevron, I guess we would have to respect whatever international mediation and arbitration centers would advise. I guess. But then again, they are issues. They are issues that are going to complicate a negotiation.
Just the last question, Patricio, because we're running out of time. If a trade deal went through in the next year or 2 or 3, what would Ecuador look like in 10 years' time? And what would be different?
We would export more. We would have we would have created more jobs. We would attract more investment from American companies. It's not the same selling your products in small scale economies than to open huge markets. So I think Ecuador would be beneficial for many Ecuadorian products, for many Ecuadorian industries, and we would attract better levels of foreign direct investment. So I think that it would help the country. We would grow at a larger pace, and this would help. This would help us in order to take out part of the population out of poverty levels.
But would most people still be doing the same things, or would the structure of the country have changed?
No. I think there are industries that we can develop, and I think Ecuador. I'm going to give you my point of view on this issue. I think Ecuador should be an agro-industrial country. It should focus on its on its farmers, on its land, exports, and locally as well. Why? Because you have an advantage. You have a comparative advantage. You can cultivate any product during the entire year. You have an advantage. And tourism is also a huge advantage, and that's what we should focus on. We shouldn't block imports on, let's say, cars, machinery. We can't produce that. I mean, we can produce cars. We can't produce machinery. Let's say machinery in order to produce let's say a chocolate bar, and we shouldn't block importations at all.
Patricio, we've run out of time, I'm afraid, but thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
It's fascinating. We've been talking to Patricio Alarcon, President of the Quito Chamber of Commerce, about the possibility of a free trade deal between Ecuador and the United States. This is Interviews from Quito. I'm Ian Bruce. Thank you for watching. Until next time.